The sun was dropping low behind the western hills when Thomas Avery, a gray-haired rancher with a tired soul, rode into the dusty town of Elridge. His horse moved slowly, much like the man who had seen more loss than most could bear. His wife had died 10 years earlier, and since then he lived alone on a quiet ranch at the edge of the desert. People in town often said he talked more to his horses than to any living soul. But that evening, something strange led him there. Outside the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered near the wooden stage where an auction was taking place. Thomas pulled his hat low and stepped closer, curious. 2 young women were standing on the stage, their hands bound, their faces covered in dust but still full of quiet dignity. The man beside them shouted, "2 Apache sisters taken from the borderlands. Strong workers. Start the bid at $20. Thomas froze. He had seen this kind of cruelty before. People treated like property. He hated it deeply. The crowd muttered, some laughed, some looked away. But the old man's heart burned. He saw fear in the eyes of those girls, but also defiance. They stood tall, refusing to bow. One of them, maybe the older, had dark hair that shone even under the dirt. The younger one's eyes were sharp, full of quiet strength. $20, someone shouted. 25, called another. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He had not come here to buy anything, but something inside him whispered that walking away would haunt him forever. When the bidding reached 30, he spoke up. His voice was rough but steady. 50, the crowd turned. People stared at the old rancher who rarely spoke to anyone. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $50. You sure, Mr. Avery? Thomas nodded once. The bidding stopped. No one wanted to pay more for 2 captives who couldn't even speak English well. The hammer fell and the deal was done. He walked up the stage slowly and handed over the money. The older sister stared at him, confused. She probably thought he was another man seeking to own them, but then Thomas reached into his saddlebag, took out a knife and cut the ropes around their wrists. You're free now, he said softly. No one owns you, the crowd murmured. The auctioneer frowned but didn't argue. A deal was a deal. The sisters looked at each other, not believing his words at first. The older one whispered something in her native tongue, and the younger one's eyes filled with tears. They didn't run. They just stood there, unsure what freedom meant in a town like this. Thomas nodded toward his horse. Come with me. I'll take you to the edge of town. Safer that way. They followed him quietly. As the 3 of them left, people watched with mixed expressions, some mocking, others curious. Thomas didn't care. He had seen enough injustice for one lifetime. Outside of town, near a small creek, he stopped. He handed them a blanket and a canteen of water. You can rest here. When morning comes, head north. There's a settlement that welcomes your people. The younger sister, still trembling, tried to speak. Why, you help? She asked in broken English. Thomas looked at her gently. Because someone should have. He turned to leave, but the older sister stepped forward. Her eyes were full of worry. No safe, she said slowly. Men follow? She looked back toward the town. Bad men. Come again. Thomas paused. He knew she was right. The kind of men who sold people didn't let them go easily. He sighed deeply. Then you'll come to my ranch. Just for a while, he said, until it's safe. The sisters followed him through the night. The stars shone bright above the desert, and the sound of horses echoed softly across the dry land. When they reached his ranch at dawn, Thomas showed them the small cabin beside the barn. You can stay here, he said. No one will bother you. The next morning he found them already awake. The older one, named Ayana, was feeding the chickens. The younger one, Nara, was sweeping the porch. They worked silently but with grace. Thomas watched them for a long time before going to the fields. Days turned into weeks. The sisters helped around the ranch without being asked. They cleaned the house, cooked meals, and mended his clothes. Thomas tried to tell them they didn't have to, but Ayana just smiled softly and said, We want. One evening, a storm came rolling across the plains. Thunder shook the windows, and the wind screamed like a living thing. Thomas found the 2 women huddled near the barn, trying to save the animals from the rain. He ran to help them, his coat flapping in the wind. Together they pulled the frightened horses inside. When the storm finally passed, all 3 were soaked and exhausted. Inside the house, Nara handed him a towel. Thomas looked at them, their faces glowing in the lamplight. For a moment he saw something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth, life, and company. His home no longer felt empty. That night he sat by the fire and the two sisters joined him. They spoke a little more than usual. Ayana told him about their tribe, how their village had been attacked and their family scattered. Nara spoke softly about the long days in captivity. Thomas listened without a word, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to promise them safety, but he knew promises were heavy things in the West. The days became gentler after that. Ayana planted wildflowers near the porch, and Nara laughed whenever the chickens chased her skirt. Thomas caught himself smiling again, something he hadn't done in years. But trouble was not far. One afternoon, 3 men from town came riding fast toward his ranch, the same men who had sold the sisters. They stopped near the fence, shouting, "Old man, you've got something that belongs to us." Thomas stepped out, his rifle resting on his arm. "Not anymore," he said quietly. The men sneered. "You think you can just buy our property and keep them?" "They're not your property," Thomas said, his voice firm. The air was tense. The sisters stood on the porch, afraid but unflinching. Thomas looked at them, then back at the men. His eyes were cold now. "Get off my land." The men saw something in his stare, something that made them hesitate. Finally, one spat on the ground. "This ain't over, old man," he growled. They turned and rode off. When the dust settled, Ayana ran to him, her eyes wet. "They come again?" she asked softly. "Maybe," Thomas said, "but I'll be ready." That night, the firelight danced on their faces. Ayana placed a hand on his arm. "We stay," she said simply. "We help you." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at her, at both of them, and realized that the quiet emptiness that had once filled his life was gone. These 2 women had brought something back into his heart, something he thought he'd buried with his wife years ago. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of another day. And deep inside, Thomas knew his life was about to change forever. The following days passed in silence. Thomas kept watch every night, sitting on the porch with his rifle resting on his lap. The sky was wide and endless above him, but his heart was uneasy. He knew the men from town would not forget. They had pride and greed, and such men never let go easily. Inside the house, Ayana and Nara tried to live normally. They cooked meals, cleaned the rooms, and cared for the horses. But the quiet fear in their eyes never left. Every sound of hoofbeats made them look toward the horizon. Thomas saw it, and it tore at him. He had lived most of his life alone, but now he felt responsible for someone again. Not because he had bought them, but because he had freed them, and in doing so had tied his heart to theirs. One morning, he saddled his horse and rode into town to buy supplies. He didn't like leaving them alone, but they insisted. Ayana smiled and said softly, "We wait. You come back." Those words lingered in his mind all the way down the trail. The general store owner, Mr. Dugan, looked up when Thomas entered. "Heard you took in them Apache girls," he said, chewing on a piece of straw. "Folks talking?" Thomas didn't look up. "Let 'em talk," Dugan nodded slowly. "Those men who brought the girls, they're not the kind that forgive, Avery. You best keep your gun close." Thomas paid for his supplies and rode back quickly. He could see his ranch from miles away. Smoke from the chimney, a sign the sisters were cooking. For the first time, he realized how much that sight meant to him. It felt like home again, but that peace didn't last. Just before sunset, the sound of horses broke the calm. Nara saw them first, 3 riders coming fast from the west. Her heart pounded. She ran inside and called for Ayana. Thomas was in the barn, and when he heard the noise, he stepped out slowly. The same 3 men who had threatened him were back, their faces hard with anger. "We warned you, old man," one shouted. "You're going to pay for taking what's ours." Thomas stood still. "They're not yours," he said quietly. The men dismounted. One of them raised his rifle. "Move aside, Avery." Behind him, Ayana and Nara stood on the porch. They didn't cry out. They didn't hide. Instead, Ayana whispered something to Nara in Apache, and both picked up wooden poles from beside the door. They would not run again. Thomas took a slow step forward. His voice was calm but full of strength. "You want to hurt someone, you'll have to go through me." The leader laughed. "You're an old fool." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but I'm the fool standing between you and 2 innocent women. That's more than I can say for you." For a moment, time stood still. The wind stopped and the air was thick with tension. Then from far off came the sound of hooves again. Not 3, but many. The men turned, startled. From the north side of the valley, a small group of Apache riders appeared, moving fast toward the ranch. They were Ayanna and Nara's people, the ones Thomas had told them about weeks ago. The sisters had secretly sent a message through a trader who passed near the ranch. The three men panicked. They jumped on their horses and tried to flee, but one of the Apache riders blocked their path. Another shouted in their language, warning them never to return. Within minutes, the men were gone, riding off into the dust. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly. The sisters stood beside him, breathing hard. The Apache riders approached, and their leader, an older man with feathers in his hair, dismounted. He looked at Thomas carefully. "You protected them," he said in slow English. Thomas nodded once. "They didn't deserve what happened." The man placed a hand on his chest. "We are thankful." He looked at Ayanna and Nara. "You can come home now." The sisters looked at each other. Nara's eyes filled with tears, but Ayanna shook her head gently. She stepped forward and spoke softly to the man in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he saw the meaning in her eyes. She wasn't ready to leave. The leader sighed and nodded. He turned to Thomas. "They choose to stay. You are good, man. We owe you." The riders left quietly, disappearing into the horizon. The ranch was peaceful again, but something had changed. That night, Thomas sat by the fire with the sisters. None of them spoke for a long while. Then Nara said softly, "You saved us again." Thomas smiled faintly. "Guess I was just in the right place." Ayanna shook her head. "No, you were the right man." After that day, life at the ranch grew easier. The fear was gone. The women laughed more often, and Thomas began teaching them to read simple English words from an old book his late wife had kept. They taught him a few Apache words in return. Some nights they sang soft songs in their language, and he would sit quietly, listening to the gentle rhythm that filled his lonely home with warmth. Spring came, painting the land in green and gold. Thomas found himself looking forward to mornings again, to hearing Nara hum while cooking, and Ayanna talking softly to the horses. One day he saw them walking together through the meadow, their hair catching the sunlight. He felt something deep inside, something peaceful, but strong. Weeks later, a preacher came through town on his way west. Thomas met him at the store and asked if he would stop by the ranch. The preacher agreed, curious about the request. When he arrived, he found the small cabin swept clean and decorated with wildflowers. Thomas stood there nervously, wearing his old but tidy coat. Ayanna and Nara were dressed in simple white dresses they had sewn themselves. The preacher looked from one to the other in surprise. "You wish to marry?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. I want to make it right. They've been part of my life now, and I can't imagine this place without them." Ayanna took his hand gently. "We choose," she said softly. "You gave us freedom. Now we give you family." The preacher nodded and smiled. The ceremony was simple. Just the three of them, the open land and the sound of the wind. When it was done, Ayanna and Nara both placed a small string of beads around Thomas's wrist, a sign of their people's promise. That night, the stars shone brighter than ever. The ranch was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Thomas sat on the porch, looking at the wide, endless sky. Ayanna leaned against him on one side, Nara on the other. For the first time in many years, he felt peace. Not the lonely kind he used to know, but the kind that fills the heart with belonging. He looked at them both and said softly, "You two saved me more than I saved you." Ayanna smiled. "Then we are even." The seasons turned again. Their ranch became known as a place of kindness. Travelers who passed through always spoke of the old man, who had once bought two women not to own them, but to free them, and how those women chose to stay and build a new life beside him. Years later, people would still tell their story in nearby towns. The story of the rancher with silver hair and the two beautiful women who found freedom, safety, and love on the same patch of Wild West land. And when the wind blew across the hills, it carried the faint sound of laughter, a reminder that sometimes mercy can grow into something even greater than love.